Hi, it's Tom here from Running Physio. Today I want to talk to you a bit about patellofemoral pain and talk through a case study to illustrate how we might start and progress exercises and the key messages we want to deliver with patient education. So let's imagine a case study to start with, one I'm sure you will have come across several times in clinic. So you've got a runner that's coming to see you. They've got maybe some left-sided patellofemoral pain. It's quite irritable at the moment. It's aggravated by going downstairs if they try any single leg squat work. And they're keen to rehab it and get better. They said they're particularly keen to have some exercises they can do because they're in the gym 2 or 3 times a week and they want to include something within their exercises there to build things up. So what we're going to go through then is looking at sort of 3 potential stages of the rehab with this, what exercises we might give initially, what we might progress on to, and what we might include at end stage before we talk about those key points for patient education. Now, there's no one right way to do this, so I'd love to hear from you in the replies if you would choose different exercises and why you might go for those, if there'd be different options that you would look at. So this isn't the only way to do it, it's just one way to do it, and I'm going to talk through some of my reasoning behind each exercise. So the patient's irritable to begin with. So this probably means we can't go straight into loading a lot around the knee without aggravating symptoms. So let's have a look at some exercises we could choose instead that are going to be more tolerable. So in their assessment, we discovered they're weak in the glute med, in hamstrings, and also in the quads. So we want to address those weaknesses. So we could include some sideline hip abduction to address the gluteal weakness. Now this has the advantage of having very little patellofemoral joint load. So it's highly unlikely to aggravate symptoms, but if they've got some gluteal weakness there, it can address that. And we can then progress this on with some resistance, either some resistance band around the thighs or roll a gym ball up the wall as part of this exercise to challenge the glutes. We could include the prone hamstring curl as there's weakness in the hamstring on assessment too. So this could be something simple like some resistance band work, or if they're in the gym, can we get them on a prone hamstring curl machine to strengthen up the hamstring? Also, again, unlikely to irritate the patellofemoral joint because the load on that joint is fairly minimal during these types of exercises. Now, if we can, because there's weakness on assessment of this patient's quads, if we can include some early quads work, that would be useful. And we know from studies that the stress on the patellofemoral joint tends to increase as we go into deeper knee flexion during activities like squatting. So what we could do is do a shallow range squat based on patient symptoms, i.e., what range is most comfortable, and maybe do a gym ball squat like you can see in the image here, because this tries to ensure that actually most of the movement's happening around the knee, so we're loading the quads rather than having the patient flexing a lot at the hip. So we've got 3 potential early stage exercises here to address their weakness in the glutes, hamstring and quads. Simple stuff with relatively low patellofemoral load, so it's likely to be well tolerated. Now, of course, we've got to test this with the patient within the session. Test is best. You need to see what feels manageable for them. We'd also want to think about the exercise dose here. So my top tip really, if someone's irritable, is first of all, the priority is what can they cope with. So if you're not sure, sometimes it's sensible to go a little bit less, do fewer reps perhaps, or back off a little bit on the load, because if you can establish something that's manageable, you can always progress it on. So with these 3, I might say, let's have these in your gym session 2 or 3 times a week. Let's find what's manageable. And then once we know what's manageable, let's progress. Perhaps progress by building those reps up a little bit, so you're looking at 3 sets of maybe 8 to 12 reps, and then start to add load to those, so we're going to get more benefits in terms of strengthening up those target muscles. So we might work at these exercises for a little while before progressing to give symptoms the opportunity to settle. And there is evidence to support that in patellofemoral pain, that loading at the hip, like strengthening the glutes, can actually settle symptoms, which can then facilitate the progression to load more at the knee. So next up, we might look to progress exercises on when they're a little bit less irritable. These images, by the way, are from our exercise sheets that you get if you enroll on Running Repairs online at the moment. We've got a great selection of these exercise images, each with a photo of the exercise, instructions, and a QR code that links straight through to a video. So the three we've got here then are progressions. We've gone from side-lying abduction into standing abduction, using some resistance band perhaps around the thigh initially, progressing onto around the shin because that will make it more challenging. Now that we're weight bearing, there's more of a balance challenge and there's likely to be more gluteal activity. So it represents a nice progression on. Because the weight bearing leg is still straight though, there's not likely to be high load on the patellofemoral joint, so it's still fairly well tolerated. As we said, there's some hamstring weakness here. We know the hamstring functions very much eccentrically during running, so our second exercise here is a double leg supine leg curl. So the patient bridges with their feet on a skateboard or on the seat of a rower. They extend their legs out, which works the hamstrings eccentrically. They drop their hips to the floor, and the coming back phase, the concentric phase, is very, very easy. So it's quite a nice challenge for the hamstring. You can progress it by loading across the abdomen or going onto single leg. And again, patellofemoral joint stress is fairly low. And then we could perhaps include the leg press in here as well. Now, we know that this patient is struggling with things like going down the stairs and single leg squat. They're painful for her. That's what she's telling us in her subjective assessment. We want to build up the tolerance of these closed kinetic chain activities. Now, sometimes going straight into single leg squats too much. So having something like the leg press where we can gradually and incrementally increase the load is a really nice option to actually build that tolerance of this kind of closed kinetic chain tasks. Now, you notice with each of these here, the exercises are slightly different colors. So our early exercises are kind of a clay color, and the mid stage are blue or yellow. This is what we've done within our exercises. We've color coded them. The early stage stuff is kind of a clay color, mid stage is a light blue, and the tougher exercises are a yellow. So when you're looking at the exercises, you can quickly get an idea of which ones are going to be more challenging. So maybe we stay with those mid stage exercises for a while. We build up the load with things like the leg press. We may also want to modify the range for that exercise too. The further they're going into knee flexion with the leg press, the more challenging it will be on the patellofemoral joint. So we can experiment a little bit, perhaps increasing load first to develop strength, and then as symptoms settle, gradually increasing the range to build that tolerance and strength through range. So we might work at some of these exercises for a period of time really to be able to get that opportunity to increase the load and get the benefits of them. Now, at end stage, let's say we've reached a point where they're now no longer particularly irritable, they're tolerating most day-to-day tasks, they've managed the exercises they've been doing well so far, so we want to progress things on a little bit more. These might be options for some of your end stage exercises. So with our standing hip abduction, we've been doing level 1, which is with the weight-bearing leg straight. The progression to level 2 here is we balance on that leg and bend the knee. So you're essentially in a little bit of a single leg squat position. And then you're going to do that hip abduction again against a resistance band. Now, I call these OMGs, which stands for Oh My Glutes, because they are a bit of a killer on the glutes. That weight-bearing leg, we've got to be able to control the position of the femur and the pelvis whilst managing that resistance through the band. So it's a big challenge for the glutes, but because we're in a bit of a single leg squat position, it's going to help build that control and tolerance of that functional task that the patient's told us is painful. You know, if we want to build up the tolerance of an activity, at some point we've got to bring that activity in. So that could be a nice way of strengthening the glutes, building that tolerance of single leg squat. Then for our hamstring exercise, we can progress on to single leg deadlift. If this is too tough or they can't control it, we could go double leg initially perhaps. But single leg deadlift is a challenge for all the gluteal muscles, glute max, glute med, and glute min. There's recent research showing that, as well as working the hamstring eccentrically and building stability balancing on one leg. So it would be more of an end stage exercise for a lot of people, and you can progress it by increasing the load. Here we're using a kettlebell as a nice option for patients. And then we could include seated knee extension. Now, this one you do need to be a little bit careful of with people with patellofemoral pain because it can be provocative. So you want to make sure they can tolerate this exercise well. We might start with low load and we might modify the range initially. Now, there's some evidence to suggest it's going to be better tolerated between around about 90 degrees of knee flexion and 50 degrees of knee flexion. So we might start within that range and then gradually progress to full range, as in from maybe 90 to full extension, and then start to build the load. The big thing, of course, that's going to guide you here is their symptoms. It's all about working with the patient, testing these exercises with them, seeing how they respond, and looking for progress at each session. Each time I'm seeing a runner, I want to see what can we build on here. Can we help you to build on a little bit more running now? Are you ready to build that up a bit more? Can we add a bit more load to your exercise, or are you ready to progress into something a bit more challenging? So each session we can see progress, and of course they can see progress, which is really important. So hopefully you can see that's an example of exercise progression that we could use in this case to address the weakness in the glutes, the hamstring and the quads, starting with low patellofemoral load, gradually increasing in terms of difficulty and stress on the joint as symptoms settle. And as I said, all those images come from our extensive exercise library that you can access if you enroll today on Running Repairs Online. Next up, let's talk about patient education. Now, with exercises, I know exercise prescription has kind of taken over as one of the big things we do now for care of people with running injuries and generally in musculoskeletal medicine, but it isn't the only thing we do. And sometimes I think there's a bit of a kind of set and forget approach where the focus is purely on exercise and we're not really addressing the patient's needs. So alongside exercise, we want to make sure the patient can understand and manage their condition. And that's where patient education comes in and is so important. Now, I've been thinking, what are the key things? If you really got me to boil it down and say the 3 key things that I would want to make sure you definitely include in your patient education for people with patellofemoral pain, I'd say the 3 key messages we've got are: 1, that it's important to modify painful activity such as running, but it might not be just running. Modify it to a manageable level. Now, what we mean by a manageable level here is that there is either no pain or only mild pain during. So I'm sure you know the kind of standard recommendations here, maybe up to a 3 out of 10 pain-wise, and it settles quickly afterwards so that there's no lasting symptoms into the next day. So we're going to do that by discussing the aggravating factors with the patient and trying to see if we can find a manageable level that works for them. Very, very important. Hard to calm down irritable patellofemoral pain if we keep irritating it. So that would be number 1, modify activity. Number 2, we want the patient to understand that pain is an increase in sensitivity, often due to training changes and not a sign of damage. Now, actually, there's evidence that shows there's central sensitization in runners with patellofemoral pain that seems to be linked to some degree with training volume. So for me, that kind of makes sense that if the runner is training a lot more, they're making the tissues around the patellofemoral joint increasingly sensitive to stress. So when they are stressed, when going up and down stairs, for example, or doing a single leg squat, it hurts because that sensitivity is elevated. So they just can't quite cope with those normal day-to-day tasks. So it's about that sensitivity. It's not about damage to the patellofemoral joint. It's a robust joint. It's got some of the thickest cartilage in the body within it. It's not harmed by running. And that's a really quite important message that we want to get across to people. So understand that pain is probably due to increase in sensitivity and not damage. And that's the second key point. The third key point is that training should be progressed gradually with adequate recovery to prevent future flare-ups. This is so important as well. A lot of people do find actually that with activity modification, patellofemoral pain can settle relatively quickly, particularly if it's an acute episode. So when it does, they often feel tempted to rush back to what they were doing before, only to encounter a flare-up and come back in with a sore knee. So it's very important that they recognise they need to gradually progress, particularly the activities that will irritate the knee. So they're training distances, potentially training speed. Downhill running, we know, has a high patellofemoral joint load. If they're into heavier squatting or heavy resisted seated knee extension work, gradually resume those activities based on symptom response. And in more complex, persistent cases, I will usually change one thing at a time. So I might look at, for example, building training volume first before thinking about increasing speed or introducing hills or whatever else is part of their goal. Now, these key messages for your patients around pain and the fact that it's not a sign of harm, around activity modification, around the phases of rehab and recovery are all included in some brilliant patient handouts we've developed for you that you get as part of Running Repairs Online alongside all those exercise images if you enroll today. So we've developed these for each of the key running injuries that you'll see in clinic. So you have these professional handouts for Achilles tendinopathy, patellofemoral pain, as we discussed, iliotibial band syndrome, medial tibial stress syndrome, plantar fasciopathy, calf pain, gluteal tendinopathy, and proximal hamstring tendinopathy. All nice and professional that you can share with your patient. They all come if you enroll on Running Repairs Online today, alongside access to that exercise library that will give you the chance to deliver very professional exercises, each with instructions, photo and video. But enrollment for our online course is closing very soon. We're into the last 2 days. It closes Tuesday night at midnight UK time. So if you want to access all those great resources, I'd enroll now and you'll immediately get access to all 18 modules of the course. Now, I hope you've found this helpful and it's given you some ideas on exercise progression and patient education. I think a lot of it comes down to a really good assessment to identify the patient's needs and then just looking to provide maybe just 3 or 4 exercises initially. Let's be realistic about this. If we overload the patient with too much to do, they're not really going to get a chance to get it done. But I'd also try and make sure that patient education and developing the understanding starts in the first session rather than as an afterthought. Quite often with runners, we will be able to continue some running with patellofemoral pain, providing we can find a manageable level for them. And actually sometimes more frequent, shorter runs will work better. So if you can find an amount they can manage, let's say it's 3 or 4K, for example, that feels good on the knee, it doesn't lead to severe pain or lasting flare-up, we might try and get them to do that 3 times a week to maintain that frequency and stimulate the tissues to build that increase in tolerance as part of this patient education. Now, this is a much more positive message than stop altogether. You know, we want them to know that running is not harmful for the joint, that they can continue doing the sport they love, but we need to get it at the right level for them. Okay, I hope this has given you some ideas for rehab that you can use in clinic. If you'd like to learn more about running injuries, do check out Running Repairs Online. We've got fantastic modules for you on each of the key running injuries you'll see. We've got modules on gait analysis and retraining and strength and conditioning. We've got loads of resources for you, as well as lots of support while you learn with live Q&As and all sorts of things that you can download and use with your patients, like these exercises and patient handouts and lots more within the course. But as I said, it is closing soon, so do check that out and enroll today to access all of that great content. Okay, thanks very much for listening. Bye for now.